Hi, everyone. I know there's still people signing on, but we don't want to waste any time for a good discussion at the end of this. So we're just going to go ahead and get started, and people will join as they'd like to. So I'm Emmeline Gojak, and I'm part of the Placemaking Collaborative at the BSA. And together, David also go next and introduce himself, and he is the co-chair as well. And we put on a great presentation with a couple of great speakers for you today. And at the end, we'll do a little bit of question and answer and discussion for anyone who has questions at the end. But feel free to add them in the chat as well if you don't have the capability to speak up.
Great, thanks, Emmeline. Yeah, I'm David Wyszynski. I'm with Handel Architects here in Boston, and Emmeline and I are co-chair of the Placemaking Collaborative group here. I think for folks that have been around for a while, we kind of know that we do some sort of virtual learning opportunities like this around placemaking, and we also like to or want to be engaged within Boston on actual projects. So we've looked into sort of pop-up placemaking events for sort of one-day events, as well as taking a look at some city sites for around Boston for potential longer-term placemaking interventions. So I think there's a chance to sort of study what's going on around the world or around Boston as well, and then also look at sort of implementation in the city. So if folks are interested in the creation of placemaking, which can be a variety of scales, feel free to join, and we have an active group that puts together events for this. Today's discussion, we've brought together a couple of two folks that have done some interesting projects around this. So Daniele Bellere is with CRA, which is Carlo Ratti Associates. They're sort of home base in Italy. And we also have Aaron Greiner here from or locally here in Somerville at Culture House, who's put together some interesting placemaking interventions around for the greater Boston region. So I think we'll start out with I'll start out with introducing Daniele. I think he'll lead off the first presentation. And Daniele is with Carlo Ratti Associates. Folks that aren't familiar, they're an international design firm they're hub based in Italy, but also have offices in New York and London. That's right. And yeah, so and they're very sort of multidisciplinary practice. So they work on scales from sort of product design up to scale of urban planning, and sort of very from a multi sort of disciplinary perspective. So in fact, today's presentation, neither of our presenters are sort of architects by background, which is cool for us because in placemaking we don't want to only just architects as part of this BSA, but want to sort of broaden it to a larger discussion around cities and places. So Carlo's background is more in contemporary history and urban studies and political science. He's also worked in sort of in journalism, doing some articles for Wired magazine, and also worked out of Moscow for a couple of years at the Strika Institute. And I think currently in your position at CRA, you're the director of curatorial projects. So you've done some work on the project I think we're going to be looking into today on the urban vision for Pristina in Kosovo. Also worked on the Biennale in Shenzhen. So I think without further ado, I can let you further introduce yourself.
Well, thanks so much, David and Emmeline, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thankful for the invitation. And I think, David, you told many things about myself. I don't know what to add. Yeah, I mean, it's as I said, I'm very happy to be here with you today, and I hope that the project we're going to discuss can be interesting and can spark a discussion. So, as David mentioned, I'm one of the partners at CRA office in charge of the curatorial projects. I'm also follow this editorial production. So the project we're going to see today somehow sits at the intersection between curatorial and editorial and communications, which are, let's say, my specialties. And so yeah, I don't know. There should be like a a good start, and then I hope that the project will also speak for itself. But thank you so much again for the opportunity of being here today.
Great, sounds good. Yeah, I think why don't we dive into yours, and then we can run back to Aaron afterwards.
Of course, shall I share my screen and start directly?
Yes, yes, feel free to go ahead. Yeah.
That's great. So I will jump directly into my presentation, and I will now move to the full screen. I hope you can see if I move from one slide to the other. Can you just confirm that, so that sometimes there is some issue with this? Amazing.
Looks
So
great.
my presentation is titled Rethinking Participation. So somehow we approach the topic of placemaking from this perspective, and especially using the work of the CRA that we developed in Kosovo, in the city of Pristina. So we were in the Balkans, in South Eastern Europe, and we worked there in the framework of Manifesta, the European Biennale. But let me just go a little bit. Let's say a few words first about our company. So CRA, as David mentioned, we're an international design office. We're based in Europe, but we work internationally. These are some of our projects. Just to mention a couple of them, what you see on the top right is the Capital Spring skyscraper, which recently inaugurated in Singapore. And on the bottom left, there's the Meat Cultural Center in Milan. And on the top left, this master plan called Biotic for the city of Brasilia. So just to give you a sense of different scales of intervention and different projects we are developing. And just to complete this, we do have, of course, our bases in Europe, New York and London, but we also have have a strong connection with Boston, because Carlo Ratti, our founder, is a professor at MIT, where he directs the Sensitivity Lab. So somebody of you might know his work also because he's very present in your territory. So that's to mention this thing. But the topic of the presentation today is, as I said, participation, and that can be intended in many different ways. Everybody is discussing that. I would say it would be hard to find any designer that does not want her project or his project to be about participation and involving people. At the same time, there might be not a consensus on what that means. So how you can really make participation. So we really would like to, let's say, try to get an understanding on this concept, and we use the project in Kosovo to experiment with that. In its essence, the idea of participation somehow boils down to this dualism, which can be summarized with those two images. So on the left, you can see somehow the classic idea of the fountainhead, so the Ayn Rand and the architect protagonist of her novel, and somehow this encapsulates a certain idea of autonomy in architecture. Architect can do whatever he or she wants, just with the power of personal will. And on the right, like the opposite vision of that says, hey, architects are actually not shaping society. Some other forces are doing that. So the very famous Bernard Rudowski exhibition on architectural architects at the end of the 1960s at MoMA. But anyway, somehow the idea of participation needs to address these sort of fundamental archetypes of 20th century vision on architecture, and probably taking something of both, I would say. And there have been some important people attempting participation in the past, just to mention Christopher Alexander in the US, or Giancarlo De Carlo in Italy, you see here on the right, and his famous project for the Matteotti village housing in a city near Rome. More recently, we have seen, that you see here on the right, the project by Alejandro Aravena in Chile, the series of, once again, social housing that was developed in this incremental way. In turn, this vision was paying tribute to John Bracken and his ideas of open-ended architecture, the idea of support and infill as concept that he first proposed once again in the 1960s and 70s. So our office has had an interest in participation for a few years, more than 10 years. We are interested in seeing how we can update the idea of participation to an era in which we've got digital tools that can make communication between people and different stakeholders a little bit easier, or anyway, it can, let's say, add another dimension to this interaction between the designer and the general public. So we call this open source architecture. We've been investigating this in different platforms. I showed before this editorial on Domus magazine. We set up a Wikipedia page, which is, of course, is open source by definition. We wrote some articles on AD, and like we later on even wrote a book on the topic of open source architecture. But that was somehow a little bit more theoretical. We did some projects throughout the years, but the most serious and the most ambitious attempt to apply the idea of open source is something that we did just a few months ago with a project that we did for Manifesta. So Manifesta, for those of you who are not familiar, is this biennale which is set in European cities. It's changing its venue every edition. And the interesting thing is that since 2018, they started to involve design practices. And the idea is that design practice should come to the city 1 or 2 years before the biennale and analyze the local context. So this was done in 2018 with OMA in Palermo, in Sicily, and it was done in 2020 with MVRDV in Marseille, in south of France. So, and then in 2022, the Biennale Manifesta went to Pristina, the capital city of Kosovo, and our office was called to develop what is called the urban vision. So that was our team, and it's an interesting concept because you've got somehow urbanism and architecture that go and like develop their own thinking before art. Somehow architecture comes before art, which is an interesting statement and the positioning for a biennale. Anyway, our team, which you see here on the right, developed this urban vision for Manifesta in Kosovo. And what about the city? It's a pretty interesting city. I'm sure not many people have been there. It's relatively isolated for different reasons we're gonna see. But if we have to say how does it look like, we can probably tell it's a city with 3 cities within itself. And the first of them is this sort of small scale buildings, winding streets that goes back to the Ottoman history. So this was part of the Ottoman Empire for many centuries. Then it was part of the Yugoslav state, so the former Yugoslavia. And in this period, there was a strong push for this sort of modernist development. And finally, in the last 20 years, after the War of Independence, which is the single fact by which most people still know Kosovo, the 1998 war. So after that, there was a sort of real estate boom. And so the city really exploded demographically. The constant thing of all these 3 cities is that the public space has never been somehow at the center of the local interest for different reasons, but somehow today public space in Pristina is in a pretty poor state throughout the city. More or less, you got this sense of like cars being an overwhelming presence and like private interest really being prevailing over the common interest. Particularly when it comes to mobility, cars are really filling in every single empty lot or empty space, and there's really many of them. So somehow it's you can say there's hardly any understanding of what public space is for different reasons. People who like to change, and we spoke with many of them, but the starting situation was more or less this. So like even where there were public spaces or like green spaces, very often they were in poor state of repairment, or they were not really well used. So the brief that Manifesta gave us for the urban vision was, how can we reclaim the public space of Pristina? And somehow these questions, I guess, can be also interpreted as sort of city making and like a space making question, because our task was evidently to reframe public space in a city that, for different reasons, did not have this strong culture of public space. So how could we do something in that sense? It was really a big question and an important challenge. And we wanted to address this by working on this new methodology for participatory urbanism, and that we hoped could address some of the challenges of Pristina, but at the same time inspire other cities internationally. Clearly, what's happening in Pristina is common to many different places, not just to Western Europe, not just to places that experienced the transition from a socialist regime to, let's say, democratic, neoliberal, free market, define it as you want, kind of society, but I guess also many other places in the world. So we approach this, our work in Pristina with this sort of iterative process that started more than 1 year before the Biennale opened. And we're gonna go through these 5 phases one by one. And the first one is mapping, which is sort of like a traditional activity in urbanism. But we approach that in a, I would say, in a twofold way. On the one end, we started to talk with people and try to ask their opinion on what the most urgent actions were supposed to be for public space in Pristina. So that was like the first step in our open source participatory methodology, and this resulted in a series of maps which were quite useful to illuminate the issues of Pristina. They were also quite conventional in a sense. So that's why we got to this second step of our work there, which was inspired by what William White had done in the late 1970s in New York. This video is sort of low quality, it's an old one, but I think it gives you a sense of what we're talking about. So William White pioneered the use of cameras to observe public space and how people were behaving in public squares and like the life of public spaces. And so he was really observing that and taking notes with this coded system of how people were behaving, how they were moving, how they were interacting. So it was really a way to observe how people use public space and respond with design ideas that would really be tailored on people's actual needs and desires. So the interesting thing is that with digital technologies, what William White did could be largely automated, and artificial intelligence can really help us doing that. And if you think of Google Street View, it actually, you can see the sort of immense repository of images of a cityscape. And if you use AI and if you analyze those thousands of images of Google Street View, you can get a sense of what's happening in cities. And based on that, you can do some design suggestions. So the MIT laboratory of Carlo Ratti did that work with Paris in the last few years. And so we wanted to do something like that also in Kosovo. And you see here more or less how this thing resulted in Paris. But the problem is that with Kosovo, you see there's you can see the location of Google Street View in Europe, and Kosovo is here in the middle. And as you can see, there's no blue lines. The blue lines are where there's Google Street View in streets of different countries. And so there is a general lack of Google Street View in the Balkans, and especially Kosovo, there's almost nothing. So how could we address the idea and this necessity? How could we start to map this aspect of Pristina? So we resolved to do that by ourselves. So we work with students and the Faculty of Architecture in Pristina, and we gave them these sort of helmets with a GoPro on the head, and they started to go around the city and mapped every single street. They go around for a couple of months by foot, by bike, by car, and they started to collect thousands of images of the city. And so we use those images to analyze public space, essentially. And this is like just a starting point of a longer research. This data is now owned by the lab in Boston, but it can be released open source if needed. And it gives a sense of how public space is actually used and like what are the different components of the streetscape. So we put together those two kinds of mapping, and we got to the second and third phase of our open source process. We call it Paint the City and Vote with Your Feet. Let me explain why. First of all, why paint the city? So somehow it's a tribute to something that we saw happening in cities internationally, especially since the COVID pandemic, since COVID-19. So what happened is that many city officials and mayors found themselves in a situation where they needed to address new working habits, new needs in terms of mobility, and of course, all of this in a framework of the Earth emergency. And so how could they do that? There was really no let's say, no case study. There was no best practices to be adopted. So many mayors internationally started to improvise, adopting sometimes very bold solutions. This is just one project in Milan, in Italy, but this has been done in many parts of the cities from Barcelona to Paris, I believe also New York, and I'm sure also many other places in the US. So the idea of like implementing these temporary interventions, sometimes even just by painting a part of the street to temporarily turn that into a pedestrian area. And that was somehow allowed by the unprecedented situation of the pandemic. So somehow we wanted to preserve this experimental spirit in Pristina. And somehow we use the maps that I mentioned before, both the conventional maps and the maps that we did using AI to implement some interventions. And so we found on the map with those few sites that could be, let's say, subject of our interventions. And we started to work there in a very fast paced way, very inexpensive way. So what we did, we started to paint down the locations. And what we wanted to do was to test how people would react. So those spaces, all of them, had the potential of like somehow making people look at public space differently and try so that people in Pristina could get a sense of how public space could be reimagined in a very inexpensive way. And if those things were successful, if people would vote with their feet, then this could be rendered permanently. I will just go quickly through the 4 interventions we did, so just to give you a sense of the methodology. So this was the first location. It's called the Brick Factories. It used to be the largest manufacturing plant in the country. It's been partially abandoned since a few years. And so what we did, we decided to turn that into well, at the beginning, we just wanted to highlight that this can be used. So in this quarter of the factory, we worked once again with students and we painted this area in yellow, very simple. And we set up an area for people to meet. We organized some movie screenings, some public debates and discussions and dinners on the future of public space in Pristina, involving people in the community. So somehow that was the first step. And then during Manifesta, this design office called Raumlabor Berlin from Germany came into the brick factory and did something that was quite useful for the community. Like they set up this series of workshops and they even put a swimming pool for like children in the neighborhood. So there was, let's say, the first step of transformation that was started with our intervention. Another intervention we did with the same methodology of the, let's say, paint the city is in this old building, which used to be a library and was abandoned since a few years. And also here we saw a potential for something that could be given back to the city, a potential new public space. But when we got there, it was, as you can see here, the garden outside of this former library was completely infested with weeds. It was barely accessible. There were cars obstructing, partly illegally, and obstructing the gates outside of the library. So what we did, we once again went there with our cans of yellow paint, and we, as you can see here on the bottom left, we did something pretty simple. We placed some bulky wooden furniture, very inexpensive, to block cars. And then we called the neighborhoods, so you see here on the right, to have a pizza together and discussing, hey, do you like it? What do you think? Would you be willing to renounce to some parking lots as long as you can use the space differently? And we did not know how people would react. So it was really somehow experimental and open source in the sense of attempting something and then looking at people's feedback to decide whether to go ahead and implement it. And this again was very successful. So it was taken over by Manifesta, and using the feedback by citizens, the whole building of the library was renovated. And today it has been turned into a new institution for culture. The final point, perhaps the most ambitious project of all that we did in Pristina, is this this strip of land that used to be railway connecting Pristina with the north of the country and with Serbia. That fall into complete abandonment for many years. And so this is how we found it when we got to Pristina. It was essentially a dump. Nobody would dare go in there. So what we started to do, we started to clean it in a very, let's say, simple way. And once again, place some temporary furniture and trees and block cars, which was already quite revolutionary given the situation in Pristina. So those small poles you see here on the back of this image were actually maybe not that glamorous in terms of design, but they were actually very useful in terms of telling people, yes, you can walk there. Cars are not just the only way you can use to go around the city. You can reclaim a space for pedestrians. And this was used during the biennial. Since this was really a temporary intervention, we wanted people to vote with their feet. So the response was mixed in this case, because this project was really, it was 1.3 kilometer of this new path. Some of this path was used, some of this path was less used, and now the city is like somehow working to bring it to the next level. So I will just go quickly because time is almost over, like just saying that the project got a great coverage, but just to sum up, this was, let's say, the project got different results in terms of being either temporary, like going from temporary to permanent, at least in 2 cases out of 4 of project we did there. In other cases, it's still gonna be, let's say, implemented, and so it's undefined. But this is somehow part of how we see this open source methodology, which we can discuss perhaps later, but somehow, to say very quickly, it combines bottom-up and top-down approaches. It focuses on the idea that designers should listen and then design, and people should speak up and then somehow vote with their feet. And somehow the idea is to develop this inexpensive intervention, and then people should respond, and this can be used to somehow accelerate the evolution of the city. So once again, the idea that this can go from temporary to permanent, I guess, is quite important in the discussion we're having about, making city better, and now to make people appreciate the public space. So there was the my whole presentation. There's a catalog of our work in Pristina that was published by Manifesta that is available online. And I guess we can discuss that later. Now I don't want to take more time, so we can listen to the next presentation, but I would like to thank you for your attention, and later on I will be very glad to answer to any question. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Daniele. Yeah, I think we'll for the folks here, we can hold sort of our Q&A till the end. We can have both presentations, and then I think that'll be a great background for asking some questions back to the presenters.
Yeah, that was first reactions. Very, very cool. I really want to look up that Google Street View and test that out. Actually, it's such a really simple way to view your project and check it out, especially when it is hard to get there and you don't always have the opportunity to have a video mounted and record, but it does it for us, and we're very lucky to live in a city where that kind of information is readily available to us. Okay, so I think yes, like David said, we'll wait to the end. Lots to talk about, but we're going to go on to the next presentation by Aaron, and he is the executive director of Culture House, and he's going to talk to you about a lot of different things, but we'll probably touch heavily upon the Salem pop-up community art space that they had done in the past, and maybe some of you have seen it. So it should be pretty interesting to see a very different presentation, very completely different context, and something closer to home to compare to. And also to say, as Aaron is also part of our collaborative group, has been a great member and very experienced in placemaking. So just we also wanted to point out with these two speakers and how different their backgrounds are, that they are not architects, and we have so much to learn from all of these different industries, and that's why we like to bring in speakers like Aaron and Daniele to come speak to all of you. So take it away, Aaron.
Thank you so much, and thank you to both Emily and David for inviting me here today, and all you for coming. And Daniele, it's so great to hear your project, and I love the kind of thinking about what are these, like this large data, how can we use that to actually inform and translate this kind of very abstract data sets we get to what happens on the ground. So it's really exciting to hear, and I love seeing that kind of thread go all the way through. Yeah, I am the director of Culture House for an urban design nonprofit based in Somerville. I'm going to share my screen and dive into the presentation. But today I really want to talk to you about the context of thinking about kind of a people first approach to creating public spaces, and use that as a way to explore what comes out of a project when we think about a different way of engaging people around these big discussions of urban design, of urban planning, of architecture. So let's see here. All right. So I've called my presentation Sticky City. Usually hopefully our cities aren't like literally sticky, like our shoes stick to the ground, but in a lot of our work, we think about creating space that brings people together, that makes them stick to each other, that makes a space that someone wants to stay in, that makes a space feel sticky in a more metaphorical way. So for a bit of background, as was mentioned, I'm the director of Culture House. We work to improve livability in local communities by transforming unused spaces into vibrant social infrastructure. So really working on making cities happier, healthier, more vibrant, more resilient, more sustainable, and more equitable through transforming public space. We work through a 5-step process in most of our work, which includes in-depth research, deep community engagement, design build, typically building out temporary spaces, quickly, cheaply, and beautifully, actually operating spaces, so really being on the ground, working with the community to open up a space for the public to test out ideas, and then gathering lots of data, qualitative and quantitative, and producing impact reports that produce impacts for projects, but also go on to suggest long-term interventions that our partners that we work with are able to implement to increase access to public space in our community. Real quickly, we work across 3 main programs. Our kind of largest program, and I'll be diving a bit more into this today, is our community pop-up program. This program, we work with communities to reimagine a vacant storefront as a pop-up public space. We also do kind of consulting work on our special projects program, specifically in the realm of community engagement and in design build and tactical urbanist design build and placemaking. And then we also have our test kitchen, which I always say is not, we're unfortunately not typically making actual food in our test kitchen, more of a test kitchen with quotes, but using our platform as a chance to prototype urban design ideas and share those broadly, similar to the Carlo Ratti philosophy of open source architecture. We're interested in open sourcing, placemaking, open sourcing, these kind of new methods of community engagement as well. So that I do want to dive just today really deeper into one project that we worked on and use it as an example to talk more broadly about our focus specifically on engagement and the way that we work with communities and work with people in our projects. And to kind of do that, I want to talk about Culture House Salem. So this was a project we worked on primarily last year in 2022. We worked with the city of Salem, and the goal was to transform Old Town Hall, which is this historic brick building right in downtown Salem, into a vibrant, connected, and accessible arts and culture space. So the city had identified that this building, it was currently not being used. The city had identified it as a priority space to be activated. They were targeting longer term investments in the building and needed some renovation work. And they identified that there was a need for arts and culture space in the community. And so we worked with them to think about how could we test out some uses of this space that would meet some of these arts and culture needs and help inform their longer term vision for this space and allow them to invest really smartly in the way that they were planning on renovating the structure. So to do this work, we really first started by talking to the community, talking to people. And we did this through non-traditional methods. So, typically we're used to having these community meetings, and oftentimes we see the same people come to those meetings every single meeting. And we don't actually hear from people who might be most heavily impacted by some of these projects. So we have developed a kind of set of interactive and engagement tools that we use for engagement in our projects. And you can see some of those in this photo here. So the first thing I've seen is a trampoline. So we always bring some sort of play activity, some active element to our engagement pop-ups. And we use those as a chance to get people to kind of free their expectations of what it means to participate in a public engagement process. And make it fun, I always say you can't be mad if you're jumping on a trampoline, it's pretty hard. So to really bring this kind of element of play, this element of breaking free from your very expectations of what it means to engage in a design project. You also see kind of hidden behind some people, we have a giant chalkboard that we ask people to write. We have a prompt up there, we ask someone to write, what is your vision for this space, and ask responses for that. Always get some great doodles from kids too. Sometimes the best ideas come from kids that write on the board. And you'll see, other tools we have here is this tube, which we have giant balls you can put and we'll vote on questions. We often include elements like, maps for you to vote with stickers on. And so we combine this in-person engagement that we do usually at the site and also at community gatherings in the neighborhood. We do typically several engagements like this. We combine that with a community survey we send out. We do often run a public meeting and also collect observational data on the site, looking at kind of a low-tech version of some of what Daniela was talking about, some of those, William H. White, Gale style data collection methods to look at traffic, person, cycle, and vehicle traffic patterns around the space to see how we might be able to affect the use patterns of the building. So, throughout all of this engagement, we discovered some really interesting things. We went into this project really thinking that we were going to be talking about physical barriers. The building itself was closed most of the time, this old town hall, and we wanted to increase access to it. And so we knew that was a priority. And we really went in thinking we would be talking about how would you want to come into Old Town Hall? What is the kind of physical barrier getting you in there? But what we encountered was actually that most of the challenges were more systemic. As I said, one of the goals was engaging with the creative community, the arts and culture leaders around this space. And as we started to talk to people, we started hearing, because we were reaching people who were not involved in these kind of processes in the past. We were hearing that for especially a lot of BIPOC artists and creatives, they felt really excluded from past processes. They didn't feel like they had access to a lot of the space. Again, not physically, but more from they had never been contacted to be invited to do an event in a space. Or if they had, maybe they'd been told that their event wasn't right for this space. And working with the city, they were really excited to learn and grow from that, which was great to have a partner that was able to hear that feedback and willing to grow from it. And so we really started to uncover these barriers around not just the physical access, but more the systemic access to this space. And also hearing from people, especially non-white residents, that they weren't, if the space didn't reflect their community, they were much less likely to go there. So taking into account all of these lessons that we learned through our engagement process, we set this priority of creating a space that was inclusive, that was buy-in for the community, that especially centered BIPOC creatives and artists, and therefore attracted visitors that were more demographically representative of the city as a whole than what we saw in existing condition analysis. So we opened the space. It was open for 3 months. And we set up the space. We transformed this kind of open hall into a segmented public space that was staffed for, I think, about 5 days a week, typically. And we included a living room area that became really popular, a place to play games, to sit, people started, without us even doing anything, started like leaving knitting supplies, leaving board games. The space really kind of grew on its own. We also had an area for art exhibits and installations, and an area for performances. And as I said, one of the big goals we really identified was creating a structure, both physically and also institutionally, that really centered some of these voices, especially of Black, Indigenous people of color, that had been excluded from these processes in the past and continued to be. And so with that, we created a concrete procedure for hosting an event at the space that included a really transparent pay structure, that included fair compensation for all artists and creatives. Physically, we made this space much more accessible in terms of its openness. So really opening the doors, creating really good sight lines into the space, thinking about the design of the space, ensuring that it felt comfortable people walking in. There was a good orientation. It didn't feel too expansive. And then we also really used networks to reach out and support artists and creatives and ask them to come and share their work at this space. And we really heard such incredible feedback from the people that ended up programming this space. They felt celebrated, represented, and included. And that was a really important thing that we saw, and that gave us a really good indication of the impact of this project. So I want to run through just a quick rundown of some of the numbers of what this space looked like and what happened in this space. So we saw 10,000 visitors over 3 months, which I said we were only open for the most part 5 days a week. So there's quite a few people that came to this space. So about 200 on an average day. We saw, interestingly, the busiest times were in the evenings. That's somewhat unexpected because there wasn't, people felt like there was
Peter,
a lot
this
to
is
do
Rena with Gun
downtown.
Partnership. How are you?
Oh, someone could maybe mute.
Good. Do you happen to get my
Excuse me,
voicemail from
Rena?
yesterday?
Thank you.
Awesome. We're looking at length of stay in the
Yes.
space.
Okay, perfect. I wasn't sure because
Sorry,
I
Erin.
sent an invite
All
but
good.
didn't get a response, so I
think you
just
should
want
be
to
able
double
to
check.
mute on your end.
Yes,
Are you able to? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. I got to hear though. I don't know what happens in the call. We got to get an update afterward. All right. So we saw about a 10 minutes average length of stay, and that was interesting. And that also affected the way that we designed the space. We designed it for much more pass-through interactions. Initially, we thought about having more lengthier performances and more sit-down experiences, but after seeing the way that people tended to use the space, we really shifted the design much more for a 10 to 15-minute interaction, which ended up working quite successfully in this space. We worked with, mostly Salem-based artists and creatives. Interestingly, when we talked to some of the collaborators in the space, 75% of them made new connections while running an event in the space, which we thought was a really incredible impact and kind of goes to inform that social cohesion that we had looked at in the beginning, and seeing these new connections being made across difference, and also people being connected now more to these structures and systems that would allow them to have more opportunities in the future in the city. And when we kind of took a step back at the end of the project and looked at all of our data and conducted our interviews and combined it into an impact report, we found 3 key impacts of the project. So the first was that we created a welcoming, accessible community space. So we really saw this increase in access to the space, and people described it as welcoming, which was very different from how it was just before. It was described as quite closed off, and people didn't really feel like it was a space for them. So that was a really important impact that we saw. We developed intentional partnerships through new channels of communication. So I was kind of mentioning in some of that outreach piece, we really discovered that creating intentional partnerships and creating really intentional structures to include the community in this process of creating the space really allowed us to kind of expand the audience and make people feel more connected to the project. And it also got us to use these different channels of communication that allowed us to reach audiences that weren't being reached before. And lastly, we activated Old Town Hall with diverse programming that represented and celebrated the Salem community. So really seeing the impact of some of those new channels and those new processes being actually physically borne out in what the programming looked like in this space, with much more diverse representation of both collaborators and visitors. And especially seeing, people who responded to our surveys, who responded to us saying, I feel welcome here, I feel represented here. That's not been my experience in the past in downtown Salem. So it was really incredible to see the kind of impact that this kind of space had on the community. I'll wrap up just a few minutes here, but if you are interested in learning more about this project, we have an entire impact report available on our website in the spirit of open sourcing, which is at culturehouse.cc/Salem. So there we have the full impact report with really a pretty in-depth description of our engagement process, our research, of what happened during the actual pop-up, and then an overview of those impacts that I mentioned. And I should say that based off of our learnings, the city has already implemented some short-term solutions and fixes to their process for working with artists and creatives that really focused on these more equitable structures, and also their long-term planning around the physical building when it comes to the architecture and renovation. The work that we did with is informing the way that they'll be long-term creating this space. So I always think it's very interesting about what is that connection between physical, the architecture of the space, the design of the space, and also the program design, the design of the interaction, the design of the engagement as well. They're all quite connected in our minds. So the last thing I want to mention before we turn it over to questions is in all of our work, again, in the spirit of open sourcing, we have done this work now in several different cities and have developed this process for creating a community engaged pop-up public space. And last fall, we launched and we published the Culture House Handbook, which is a book that goes through our 5-step process that I mentioned at the beginning: research, community engagement, design, build, operation, impact reporting. And it's broken into 5 chapters, one for each of those processes. And each chapter goes through the way that we approach that work. We give examples, suggestions, recommendations, and tools. And so that is available on our website at culturehouse.cc/handbook. It's available to view online for free, and then we do offer paid downloads or physical copies. So if anyone's interested in learning more about our process, it's a great place to start. It has a whole host of resources and interesting stories to page through there. So with that, I want to say thank you so much for listening to me speak, and I'll turn it back over so we can get started on questions.
Thank you so much, Aaron. That was great. Another really engaging visual presentation. Very much appreciated, and appreciate the background you gave on your company, because I just think it's a very different approach that maybe we can learn from as architects, in that sometimes we don't get the opportunity to do this great community engagement, but maybe there's partners out there like Culture House that we can work with on a project and suggest to our clients.
Absolutely.
So I did see someone post one question in the chat for Aaron, so I'll ask that one quickly and then open it up to anyone else who'd like to ask questions. So this is from Barbara. Any homeless issues with public space or with space open to the public?
Absolutely. So happy to answer that. The first thing to acknowledge is that public space is a really important resource for people who are homeless or unhoused. Oftentimes public space is one of the only places that someone can live if they don't have other options. And when we are in a place with housing crisis, as we are in Boston, places that don't provide good social services, oftentimes, the homelessness crisis is borne out in public space. So it's something that we interact with quite frequently. Certainly, it really does depend on the community. So we work in some areas that have a high social service need, others that don't. We have done work and are doing upcoming work in Harvard Square in Cambridge, which has quite a high social service need. And so when it comes to our work and the way that we intersect with homelessness, there's really a number of key ways that we work through this. The first is always leading with compassion. So we have extensive training that we give our staff in our spaces about how to respond appropriately to any situations that might arise, whether it's connected to homelessness or not. But we do know that oftentimes conditions of homelessness can lead to mental health crises. And so when we take the approach of a trauma-informed approach to managing public space, we can be compassionate when it comes to helping people out who are sometimes experiencing one of the worst days of their life. And so we give our staff extensive training about de-escalation, about ways to, again, respond appropriately and not overreact to situations that arrive in public. We also think really carefully about what we can provide as a public space operator and as a design organization. So, we are trained in public space operation, but ultimately our primary goals, we aren't social service providers in the large sense of the word. And it can be dangerous for us to take on too much responsibility if we don't have the proper resources to back that up. And so really mostly we rely on building strong networks with other providers in the area. So working with area homeless shelters, working with housing placement organizations, and we arm ourselves with resources to be able to refer people to these organizations that can provide them the services they're actually looking for. So it's a really multi-pronged approach. But again, our goal is that people can spend time in our spaces and be welcomed and be happy and healthy there. And so we really focus our response on providing resources and again, responding appropriately in times of conflict.
Thanks. Well, first I'd like to really thank both Daniele and Aaron for those presentations. I think there was really interesting, like sort of visual results of just what came out of it, but also the sort of background that you do to sort of generate the ideas of what you're going to create for these places is really fascinating. I guess I have a two-part question. I think one is maybe for Daniele around when you were approaching placemaking or approaching this sort of interactive urbanism and approaching people in different places. Is it something that can apply, say, in Kosovo, the way that it was done to other cities like in Marseille, or other cities that have had these type of interventions, or is it sort of each one has a sort of individual approach that you need to look at based on the context? And I guess then the follow-up is at the end of Aaron, you had sort of some really interesting statistics at the end, and Daniele, I think you had some sort of final conclusions. How are you collecting the sort of data from these interventions? Because some of that I think there are sort of numbers around percent, the experiences people had. Others, I imagine, are more like a sort of narrative, or like we liked this something about the space. How do you compile that into sort of a final summary of what how it went and what you recommend for that space going forward?
Yeah, so I would say the interest of creating better participation processes is universal. So that I would say it's a objective and something that we would like to do in any place we work. So regardless of course, the specificity of the history of different cultures and different social issues and any kind of variable. So clearly it's different working in a place like Kosovo compared to other cities in different parts of Europe or the United States. So it's a pretty unique place with a very dramatic history, and so it's clearly any action there should have to be particularly sensitive, and like we wanted to act and not being the foreigners that get there with the silver bullet for the local context. But the open source approach was adopted precisely because it allowed us to somehow keep the discussion open. So we saw ourselves more as facilitators and people that could suggest solutions, but ultimately those solutions should be appropriated by the local community. And the way in which this happens and will happen will be largely independent from our will. And I think that is totally fine. It's actually, at the beginning of the presentation, I was showing the image of the Fountainhead movie from the novel by Ayn Rand. And I think that we are really rejecting that approach where the architect as the solution for all of society's predicaments. And on the contrary, I think it is also not about, we should not disappear as professionals. The urban professionals should have quite an important role to play. But I would say what we did in Kosovo, which is some more like a universal quest, is how can we make the architects, let's say, establish a relation with the audience, with the public, and really like a dialectic relations. So our proposal was really just a start of a process. So I don't know if that answers your question, but like I would say all our interventions have different results. Some of them were very successful since the first day. Some other were, let's say, mixed results, because our assumptions on what could be done, even though it was based on research and talking to people and something else, could then follow a different course. So we thought it was more important to listen to people and to make let's say an initial test of possible design improvements, then to make let's say several small interventions, then to make one big intervention that was already, let's say, full-fledged and completed and preset in its outcome. So we wanted to keep it more like open-ended. So the process was about that, and I guess the result and how the situation will evolve in Kosovo, in Pristina, will build on this approach, but like taking its own course. So it's also like a lesson in somehow humility. You're not gonna, you cannot solve all problems in 1 year or something, but you can give a contribution so that people can be more aware of how the situation can be, how things can be changed somehow.
Yeah, I just want to, I mean, echo some of those points. Those are fantastic, and I'm always right. Every project that we do as well is very specific to a local context, local community. But I'm always surprised at how some of the processes that we create behind the scenes to implement some of these projects, how universal they can be, how universal some of these ideas around how we talk to people, how we engage people, how we bring people into this process. We developed most of our work quite locally, but now we see our process being used not just outside of our own community, but across the region, nationally, and interest internationally too. So I'm always impressed by how universal some of these processes can be. To also just get quickly to your second point about data collection, personally, we use a combination of observational and conversational data collection. So we use some of, as people are familiar with the Gale observational collection tools, including mapping desire lines, taking demographic count information, looking at where people are sitting and staying. So we do that data collection. Because in our model, we operate public spaces that we are also staffing while they're open. We do have someone always there, and part of their job is to be collecting this data. And then we do a lot through surveys as well and conversations. We're looking more recently into some more technological solutions for data collection, including looking at cell phone data, look at some of these like larger, I'm really interested in this Google Street Map data as well. But we're always trying to look into new ways of collecting data, but currently use those primary methods.
That's great. Thank you both. I really appreciate how both of you really had a step-by-step layering to not just coming in and saying this is what we want, is that you really, each of you built upon and to finally get to the design and solution. And I would love to be able to do that kind of build upon in our projects on site. Someone else has a question for you in the chat for both speakers. Were there any positive economic impacts to the surrounding area observed?
Yeah, shall I just respond quickly? There were, so Manifesta as a whole was organized with the Biennale, was organized with the purpose of bringing value to Pristina and to Kosovo, which have been outside of any, let's say, it's not easy to reach from other parts of Europe. So it's a little bit isolated. And so it was meant as a way for local artists and local communities to be really at the center of the cultural conversation in Europe. And so there was a great benefit. There were more than 800,000 people visiting all the exhibitions. So that is to respond, let's say, more broadly on Manifesta as a biennial in which our project was situated. In terms of what we did, I would say the benefit that we observed was in giving people public spaces. So I would not be exactly sure how that can be answered in terms of economic benefit. I would say I would frame the importance of public space in going beyond economic values that usually somehow can be reconduced to this market idea. And I'm very much opposed to the idea this public space should be commodified. So in the sense, the idea of public space, we built some public spaces that were not there. Some of them are now permanent. So this former library is now what is called Center for Narrative Practice. That has been used as a co-working space, as a space for people to access books and read, or just to express themselves with creativity. With the Green Corridor, which I think you remember, the former railway tracks, that actually brought public space in one of the most socially deprived areas of Pristina, where some communities, that there's a Roma community that has long been very segregated in the city. And so we hope that we managed to bring them some space that could be enjoyed more than people that live there, but at the same time the people would also be able to access that part of the city. And I know that in the United States there is always the concern on the risk of gentrification, so we were very much aware that, or we were really looking into the risk that could happen. Fortunately, there is no such risk in sight, given that the economic conditions and the development that is happening is very far away from seeing anything like that happening. So in that sense, there were some basic public spaces created that people could enjoy. We saw local, like, children from those houses. It's a little bit more than it's like an informal settlement somehow. So many of those people never had some proper nice public space where they could, I don't know, do some normal things, meet with their friends, play some games. And so in that sense, I believe that our project were able to bring some value to those communities, but would not use the framework of the economic value, even though you might say in the future this will boil down to some economic variables. But I would say the benefit was more in terms of publicness, and publicness, I would say, goes beyond the evaluation on economic value.
And yeah, I'll jump in quickly and say in our work we do typically economic value. I also really heavily relate to this concept of public space, ideally being or not being required to necessarily bring economic value, and it being a bit disconnected from needing to generate revenue. But that being said, of course, we know that I think the economic value that we're looking for in a space it's about uplifting community members and bringing them economic value and supporting more local. So in our project, we do typically see some economic impacts in that realm. It depends on the project. For the particular project I was talking about, the largest economic impact
more related to working with some of these local artists and creatives and providing payment for a lot of people that hadn't been able to be paid for some of their services before. And so supporting a lot of these small creatives, small businesses. And other projects, we focus more on cities that have downtowns that are looking for a reinvestment. We did a project in Peabody, Massachusetts, and saw over a 60% increase in positive associations with the downtown during the project. And that has really significant impacts on all the businesses downtown. People have a better association with the whole area.
Thank you both so much. I just want to be respectful of everyone's time. I appreciate everyone that did hang on. I just posted our emails, David and my emails in the chat. If you do have a question that we didn't get to, please feel free to email us. We'll pass it along to the speakers, and we'll get that answer over to you, or if you want to chat further with them about what they do. So thank you, everyone. Really appreciate your time. The recording will be posted in a few days if you'd like to share it with anyone in your network. Great. Well, we hope to see you at our next, see that, ordering the book, love that. Hope to see you, everyone, at our next presentation.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.